Welcome back to Bible Answers Now. Today's question is one that might surprise you. What were the laws before the Ten Commandments? It's an intriguing thought, isn't it? What laws did God expect people to follow before he gave Moses the famous tablets? Well, the Bible has a lot to say on this topic, and we're going to dive into it today. Before the Ten Commandments were given at Mount Sinai, God had already established moral laws for humanity. These laws were not new. In fact, they were rooted in the very nature of God and revealed in his dealings with people long before the formal covenant with Israel. Let's look at some key verses that shed light on this important question. First, let's go back to the very beginning of human history. In Genesis 4:7, God speaks directly to Cain, warning him about sin. If you do well, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Here, God's moral law is clear. Sin is something to be resisted, and Cain is accountable for his actions. This wasn't an arbitrary rule. It was a moral law that reflected the character of God himself. Sin, at its core, is lawlessness, 1 John 3:4, and in this instance, Cain was warned to make the right choice. Now let's turn to a passage in Genesis 26:5, where we see Abraham's obedience to God's commandments. It says, "Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." This verse shows us that long before the Ten Commandments were written down, Abraham was already living according to God's moral laws. Though the specifics aren't listed here, this shows that God's expectations for righteous living existed before the formal law was given. Another crucial verse comes from Romans 5:13, which says, "For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law." Here, Paul is explaining that sin was still present before the law, but the law defines what sin is. This highlights a significant truth. Even before the Ten Commandments, people were accountable to God for their actions, and sin was still a problem. God's moral law existed, even if it wasn't codified in the way it would be later. This leads us to a very important point. While God's moral laws were known to those who sought him, they were not as formally laid out as they would be at Sinai. The Ten Commandments were not the first moral laws. Rather, they were a more complete written revelation of God's expectations for his people. These laws served as a foundation for society, pointing to deeper spiritual truths and teaching people how to live in relationship with God and with one another. But what about the Sabbath? Yes, the Sabbath was also established before the Ten Commandments. In Genesis 2:3 we read, "Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made." This is the first mention of the Sabbath, and it's set up before the law was given to Moses. God rested on the seventh day and sanctified it, making it holy. The idea of a day of rest, holy and set apart, was a foundational law that predated Sinai and was later enshrined in the Ten Commandments. God's moral law, the essence of right and wrong, was clear from the very beginning. In fact, these moral principles didn't just start with Moses, they were deeply ingrained in the human conscience. We see in Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve sin, that they immediately feel guilt. This sense of guilt and the desire to hide from God is a natural consequence of knowing that they violated his moral law, even before it was written down for all to see. Here's a thought to consider. How often do we, like Adam and Eve, try to hide our mistakes when we know we've broken God's moral law? It's easy to point out when others break God's laws, but when we mess up, it can feel harder to face the truth. The reality is, God's laws are not just written on stone, they are written on our hearts. So, what does all this mean for us today? How can we apply this to our lives? First, remember that God's laws are timeless. They're not just a set of rules. They reflect his perfect, loving character. When we live according to these laws, we align ourselves with God's purpose for our lives. It's not about legalism, it's about living in a way that honors God and blesses others. Take a moment to reflect. Are there areas in your life where you've been ignoring God's moral laws? Maybe you've been rationalizing certain behaviors. Today is a great day to bring those things before God in prayer. Ask him to help you live according to his ways and to reveal areas where you may need to make a change. Journal about the ways God has revealed his laws to you in your life. To wrap up, remember that before the Ten Commandments, God's moral law was already in place, guiding his people. From Cain's warning to Abraham's obedience, from the Sabbath to the internal conviction of sin, God's law was always present. The Ten Commandments weren't the beginning of God's law. They were the culmination of it, a clear revelation to guide his people into a closer relationship with him. Thank you for joining us on Bible Answers Now. What's your favorite verse on God's moral law? Share it in the comments below. And if you found this answer helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might appreciate it. May God bless you and your loved ones.